Good afternoon. My name is Wendy Brown, and I have the honor of introducing a really wonderful group tonight who are going to speak to the question, who owns the founding, in relationship to, on the same page text for this year, the soundtrack of Hamilton. Who owns the founding? It might seem like a quaint question for historians, but I think it couldn't be more urgent politically today. It bears on our controversies about monuments and memory, and the question of how to memorialize and criticize the potted history, early history especially, of the United States. Who owns the founding bears on the statement uttered just last week from a self-proclaimed Nazi who shot at a protester outside the Richard Spencer event at the University of Florida. He said, and I'm quoting him, "Our founding fathers were white nationalists. Understanding that means it's okay and doesn't make you a racist." It's hard to parse that sentence all at once, but there it is, who owns the founding. Who owns the founding, of course, bears on the Supreme Court majority insistence that it's following the original meaning of the Constitution at the same time that it has been empowering corporations, restricting the claims of labor, of citizens and consumers in scores of decisions over the past 2 decades. So who owns the founding? It bears not only on our encounter with whitewashed histories and erased histories and mythical histories, but also on controversies not easily settled about cultural and historical appropriation in music, in theater, in film, the visual arts. Controversies about who represents what and whom, rightfully or not. Who owns the founding concerns how we narrate history, how we interpret it, how we use it, but also how history narrates us, how it interprets us, how it shapes what's intelligible, what's legitimate, and what's out of bounds, what we honor, what we value, what is in the light, and what's out in the shadows. So in studying the founding of the United States, or in theatricalizing it, as Lin-Manuel Miranda has, we need to know not just what the founders thought or meant or did, and not just what we think of what they thought or meant or did, but what stories of the founding prevail, what those stories emphasize and leave out, how they shape our self-understanding, and how they might be contested for other understandings, how we might even manage some plural understandings of the founding without losing our minds. I'm suggesting that the question, who owns the foundings, is a really big, persistent question, not a question we answer, but a question that we can use to try to open up the present and open up some possible futures. And that's what our panelists this afternoon are going to do. They're going to reflect on this question, who owns the founding, in the context of Hamilton and perhaps beyond. So let me just very briefly introduce them in the order in which they will speak. We're going to hear first from Mark Peterson, who is professor and chair of history here at Berkeley. Professor Peterson teaches and writes about colonial America and the American Revolution. And among his many accomplishments, he has edited papers of select Puritan thinkers, most notably John Winthrop. He's written a book on Puritan New England and is currently completing an early history of Boston. After Mark, we will hear from Shannon Steen, who is associate professor in our Department of Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies, and also an affiliated faculty member of American Studies. Professor Steen concentrates on critical race and performance theory, and she writes about the intersection of Asian and African American racial determinations and encounters. Her first book, Racial Geometries of the Black Atlantic, Asian Pacific, and American Theater, is being followed by a second book on these themes, more focused, I think, on California. And our third speaker is Robin Davis Gibran Kelly. He's Gary B. Nash Professor of History at UCLA. He trekked all the way up from his heat to our heat today to do this. Professor Kelly teaches and writes on American and African American history, if we can and continue to make that distinction. His emphasis is radical social movements and the politics of African American culture, including jazz, hip hop, and visual art. He's written a singular biography of the jazz great Thelonious Monk, a history of the American Black working class, a splendid study of 4 jazz artists who bridge the African and North American continents, and much more. He also writes regularly in public forums, and he happens to be one of my most crucial political intellectual lodestars. So we'll start with Mark Peterson, then Shannon Steen, and then Robin Kelly. Mark. Oh, and then we'll have conversation, of course.
I indeed teach American history in our department here, and I focus on colonial and revolutionary America. And so it's from the perspective of a historian that I'm going to be approaching today's subject. And in particular, I'm going to focus on immigration as central to the Hamilton musical, as we've seen, and also to thinking about Hamilton and his career. So if we're going to be addressing the question of who owns the founding, and I agree it really is an important question today, we, I think, have to at least start by thinking about what was or what is the founding, because I don't think that's an obvious question. I was struck both by looking at the biography that was the text, the basis for Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical, and by attending the play itself, what a fairly traditional or conventional version of the founding was that Ron Chernow's book and the play begin, at least in terms of plot and the organization of the story. That is, the story of the founding as told through Hamilton that the musical offers is a kind of a cross between Bildungsroman, you know, the young Hamilton fighting over various kinds of difficulties and challenges, coming of age, becoming an important person, and then the revolution, constitution-making, launching of the United States as essentially the work of a relatively small handful of great men, for want of a better term. That in that sense, the founding that's offered by these works is a quite conventional and a traditional one. And from my perspective, as I teach this as a course in early American history, or if I think more generally about the larger course of American history, we could offer a wider variety of definitions for what the founding was, or even when it was. That is, the simple fact that a revolution was fought, independence was won, a constitution was created in the 1770s and 80s doesn't mean that there haven't been other profound founding moments in American history since then, by which I include the Civil War and its remaking of the United States Constitution. And in another context, I'm prepared to argue that we may very well be facing yet another potential founding moment in the United States that we live in today. But for the purpose of what I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes, I'm going to offer a definition of the founding, which is much like the general one I use when I teach the Revolution course, which is that what we might think of as the American Revolution, the Constitution, and the launching of the United States was a several-decade period in which Britain's colonial empire, which was on the verge of enormous expansion in the 1760s and 70s, is effectively seized by free white Americans as their own empire and largely remade for themselves. That, as one working definition of the founding, is something worth taking seriously. And in that light, I want to think about Alexander Hamilton as an immigrant, because the play itself very much puts him and several of his associates forward in that light. And of course, since then, Lin-Manuel Miranda has made the compelling, interesting video using some of the music and the musical style from the play to portray the contemporary immigrant experience in very compelling terms, asking the question or making the claim that immigrants get the job done. So what I want to do for a few minutes is to think about immigration in the era of Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton arrived in New York from St. Croix in 1773. And so I want to talk about what did this word or this concept of immigration actually mean in the age of Hamilton. The first important point is that this period, the 15 years before the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, was a period of incredibly heavy migration to colonial British America. In fact, it's among the best documented periods that we have of this time. But during that era, that 15-year period, there were 30,000 migrants from England. There were 40,000 more from Scotland, another 55,000 from Ireland, and this was all mostly all from Northern Ireland, Protestant Scots-Irish migrants. About 12,000 more from Germany, almost all of whom go to Pennsylvania. And then the biggest of all of the groups, migrants from Africa, to the tune of about 85,000 people. So altogether, in that period in which Hamilton comes to New York, he is one of almost 250,000 migrants coming to British America at the time. And as I mentioned, this was a huge wave of migration, a greater than 10% increase in the settler population of British America in the 15 years before the Revolution. Now let's think about who these people are and what that migration meant. In other words, where were they actually going, and under what conditions was this 250,000 people coming to British America in Hamilton's era? The map on the right is indicative of where most of them are going. I'm not sure how well this comes through, but here is the Atlantic coastline. Hamilton, of course, and famously, whoops, I revealed myself a little early there, famously comes to New York City. But as this map suggests, all of the dark areas are the areas where the largest number of migrants are going in this period. The vast majority of this migration isn't going to urban coastal America. They're being pushed into the agricultural regions, the backcountry. They're being imported as laborers. And the bulk of them, 63% of them, were bound laborers. They were either enslaved Africans or indentured servants who, at the moment that they arrived, would have been sold. Their labor for 5, 7, 9 years, sold to the highest bidder, and then moved out into the interior to open up some of these new regions of settlement that older American colonists, land speculators, merchants, and the like were developing. These were uprooted and deracinated people, most decidedly the enslaved ones, but also many of the indentured servants coming from the British Isles as well. They had no connections, they had no supporters or people. Many of them were impoverished and destitute. As I suggest, they're going to agricultural and backcountry destinations, and they are, on the whole, neither literate nor educated people, and their opportunities for those, at least in the earlier years, were quite limited. This portrays the so-called middle colonies from roughly Virginia northwards to New York, and this was the destination of a large number of these people. The other major destination in this era, of course, is the American South, from Virginia southward through Georgia. And in these colonies, the same pattern is replicated. That is, the migrants are pushed into the countryside and serve as agricultural labor. But here, virtually all of them are migrants who are enslaved for life, who are not just unable to get, but are actively denied education and literacy. They are denied marriage, they are denied inheritance, they're denied property. And this really struck me hard in terms of the Hamilton musical and the emphasis in that compelling first song on what's your name, right? Alexander Hamilton, right? Well, Hamilton has his name, but the great bulk of the people who are coming from Africa in many cases have their names ripped from them and are renamed in this process. What this means then is that the musical's depiction of Hamilton and his friend Lafayette, and the actual truth of Hamilton and Lafayette in the 18th century was that insofar as we can even think of them as immigrants, they were extreme outliers. So Alexander Hamilton, depicted here in the John Trumbull portrait, was free and literate already before he arrived. He was connected. That is, the people who brought him, paid for his voyage to New York, were connections of the merchant house that he had worked for in St. Croix. Those connections were so strong that he goes to King's College, the forerunner of Columbia College and University, shortly after he arrives. Just to give some context, the average class size of King's College in the 20 years before the American Revolution was 11 students per year, right? It's an incredibly tiny elite who go to King's and the other 6 or so British American colleges in the colonial period. So his connections were strong. He is very much an urban person. He is drawn to New York and its strong commercial world, and they quickly helped to make his rapidly increasing fortunes. By comparison, though, by comparison to Lafayette, here depicted in his role as general over French troops in America, Hamilton was positively impoverished and underprivileged compared with Lafayette, who, of course, was free, literate, connected. Yes, he was a marquis. You could say he was underprivileged only insofar as he wasn't a duke, right? But of course, he did marry the daughter of a duke and was raised in Luxembourg Palace in Paris. And so I think that might have made up for it. He was urban. He was, of course, military. And I think we've really stretched the limits of the word immigrant to talk about him in those terms, because he had no intention of moving to North America. He was a titled aristocrat in France and was serving effectively in America as a kind of mercenary. So I've put this word immigrant in quotation marks to talk about these people in the 18th century, because in my line of work and in the everyday usage that I have for the process that we're talking about here, yes, Hamilton and Lafayette are extreme outliers in the waves of people who are coming to North America in this time. But we usually don't use the word immigrant to describe those. That is, we use the word colonist, right? And the process that is being called immigration or immigrants by the musical today and being projected on this is really the process that historically we much more commonly refer to as settler colonialism, right? And so the thing that I have found befuddling in trying to think about Hamilton the musical and what it's trying to do by projecting words like immigrant onto a Hamilton or a Lafayette is not, you know, the validity or the importance or the power of the images that are being put forward in that video of modern immigrants to the United States working in factories or working in shops or, you know, getting ahead and doing what they're doing. I'm utterly sympathetic with that. But what seems befuddling to me in some ways is the desire, not the desire I think I understand, but the insistence on taking essentially a modern concept of what immigration has come to mean in the United States and plopping it on representatives of not just settler colonialism in general, because as I've said, a huge percentage of the people who were part of that process were doing it either against their will or with very little volition involved, but rather putting those terms on the leader of those Americans who are seizing the British colonial project for themselves and making the United States into the kind of country that can continue that process. So let me close just with this last set of thoughts. What was then the real Alexander Hamilton's role in this transition from settler colonialism, which makes sense when we're talking about movement of peoples to North America well into the 19th century, to the more modern concept of immigrant that Miranda's musical is putting forward? And really what Alexander Hamilton does during the course of his career is to accelerate the movement from the era of settler colonialism to that of immigration. He does that as Secretary of the Treasury and as one of the framers of the Constitution by helping to secure the United States seizure of Britain's colonial project. That is, all of the ways in which the national government was dramatically strengthened and then employed by Hamilton in the Constitution and at Treasury were there in order to make sure that this project remained in Americans' hands and wasn't lost. Secondly, he models the United States very much on Britain's example. Everything that he does as Secretary of the Treasury is based on a set of ideals about finance and banking and credit and manufacturing that he takes from the British model. And finally, his interest in the development of manufacturing and urban life, and this is what creates the conflict with the Jeffersonians and the Madisons that the play depicts quite accurately. That's exactly the kind of thing that begins to transform the United States into the sort of country where immigration in the modern sense, as opposed to settler colonialism, makes the most sense to describe what's happening. So I'm going to leave it there and hand it over to Shannon to take up the conversation and move us forward. So thank you.
It's a terrific program that Berkeley has, and as a theater historian, I'm deeply excited about the fact that we have a piece of theater as the featured work this year. I also want to extend my gratitude to Eric Schickler for organizing the panel today, as I think it's asking us to think about some questions that to me are really the central questions about the cultural and I think the political phenomenon that Hamilton has become, and I think will continue to become, as I'll talk about over the course of the presentation. Like Professor Peterson, I'm fascinated by this question that Professor Schickler has posed for the panel, the question, who owns the founding? It seems like almost an impossible question to me, partly because it raises to me a couple of even larger questions. Largely, what does it mean to own a historical event? What does that raise? And is that even what we do as researchers and writers and teachers of that history, or as artists trying to represent it? I think that Professor Schickler posed this question on the back of the influence that Hamilton is having on how the origins of the US are being taught in American high schools now, where its inclusion in the history curriculum is spreading, perhaps to the detriment of much of the information that Professor Peterson just laid out for us so beautifully. I'm going to lay out a couple of examples of this. Some of you may have had high school teachers who used the musical in this way. I know I taught a course last spring in which we talked about Hamilton at the end of the course, and the students, several of them, talked about having high school teachers who had already used the musical. So here are some examples. The 8th grade teacher, Angelica Davila in Los Angeles, who has her students choose one of the characters in the musical and then write a biography based on that character. A high school teacher in New Jersey, whose name I couldn't discover, sadly, who uses Cabinet Battle #1 in the second act between Hamilton and Jefferson to teach the debates over the possible founding of a national bank. The Rockefeller Foundation's decision to purchase 20,000 tickets for New York City school children to go see the musical at a cost of $1.5 million. Their funding also to the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, which through another $1.5 million grant offers a Hamilton curricular integration program that includes lesson plans, posters of founding documents and other primary source materials, videos, and so forth. Students in the program do things like learn how Lin-Manuel Miranda used source materials in order to construct the musical, and then are given exercises where they take source material themselves and make their own performances based on that source material. As someone who teaches theater history, I love that exercise. I think it's amazing. Many of these efforts focus on Black and Latino youth, in no small part for the way that the musical uses a musical language that's already exciting to them. And what you hear over and over again in accounts of these exercises is that students who think that the founding of the country has nothing to do with them, or people who look like them, all of a sudden feel like this is their history too. In other words, Hamilton allows a whole lot of people, especially young people of color, to feel like they own the founding, that they have a felt relationship to the origin of the nation that they have not felt in the past. I think we shouldn't underestimate how powerful that nascent feeling of ownership is. It's really important that the musical can enable that sensibility. And so for precisely those reasons, I think it's crucially important to ask what exactly the story of the founding that the musical tells is. and how some of the theatrical dimensions of that narrative, its lyrics, its staging, and in particular, its casting, shape how we think about the founding of the country. So I'm going to focus on those questions here. And in order to answer that, I'm going to start with one of my favorite quotes about the show, which is Barack Obama's comment from 2016 that Hamilton, I'm pretty sure, is the only thing Dick Cheney and I agree on. Like almost everyone to whom I read that quote, I laughed when I first read it. And then I started asking myself, what does that mean? That Dick Cheney, who is the architect of the Iraq War, the very powerful, controversially so, vice president for what was one of the most divisive presidencies in US history prior to this one, loves Hamilton. And why would Cheney, whose politics and my understanding of them seem antithetical to the image of a group of Black and Latino people standing on stage singing about revolution and how I'm not going to miss my shot, love this show? I want to offer today that this is possible because the musical actually tells a story about the founding that is entirely consistent with a narrative that we refer to as American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism is the belief that America is not only unique among the nations of the world, but is actually superior to those nations, and not merely for economic reasons, although those are important, but that the US is morally and politically superior to the rest of the world, that it's unique in its early experiments with democracy, in particular its experiments with non-monarchical governance. It's unique in its pursuit of political equality, of which the successes of the mid-20th century civil rights movement are symbolically key, as is its immigration history. And that because of that history, the US sees its democracy as a model for other countries, that it has a moral duty to ensure that that model is adopted and protected in other countries. It's the idea, in the other words, that the US serves as a city on a hill for global democracy. That phrase enters the political lexicon under Kennedy. It's one of Reagan's banner phrases for foreign policy initiative. It's still very much in circulation today. One of the questions that's been raised about the current administration is, in fact, whether Trump will irreparably damage this role that America holds in the global order. And I want to talk for just a moment about how the musical forwards an exceptionalist narrative about the founding. Part of this narrative is found in the repeated trope of the immigrant that Professor Peterson talked about in his presentation. From the opening number in which we learn about Hamilton's birth and migration from the Caribbean, to Hamilton's self-description as young, scrappy, and hungry, and not throwing away my shot. Those phrases are among the most repeated in the lyrics in the show, and they reconfirm the idea of the US as a meritocracy, that with hard work and with scrappy outside-the-box thinking, that you too can rise to be not just a powerful person in your world, but to help elevate your nation as a whole. This is a story that Americans love to tell ourselves about ourselves. It's one of our most powerful mythologies. And the immigrant trope also gets repeated in one of the most popular lines of the show from the number Yorktown, when Hamilton and Lafayette reunite, and Lafayette congratulates Hamilton on finally receiving a field commission that he's been pestering Washington for a big chunk of the first act. Hamilton says, we're finally on the field, we had quite a run, and Lafayette says, immigrants, we get the job done. This seems like almost a throwaway line that Miranda inserted as maybe an inside joke into the show, but in performance, it's a line that actually stops the show for a moment. When they opened Hamilton for previews at the Public Theater, the audience erupted into applause every night when this line went down. And so the musical team actually added a couple of bars of what's called vamp. Vamp is where the orchestra keeps playing whatever they've been playing to give the audience time for their applause or for their laughter or whatever it is to subside, and they can improvise that music indefinitely, which they ended up having to do. So initially they added 2 bars of vamp after that line. They extended it to 4 when the audience kept filling it. They actually allowed then at one point for the orchestra to just keep playing until the audience stopped applauding. And what they found was that they actually had to curtail the vamp back to 2 bars because the audience would just keep filling that time for as long as they would let them do it. It's a really big line inside of the show. The line was popular enough that it eventually became one of the marketing taglines on the show that was used on posters and so forth. And Miranda ended up using it, as Professor Peterson points to, as the title to one of the songs of the spin-off album of the musical, the Hamilton Mixtape, which was released in December of 2016. The song, Immigrants, We Get the Job Done, dropped ahead of the full album release, making it one of the tracks that would help market advance sales for the album. I'm going to come back to this song in a minute. The repetition of the immigrant status of Hamilton and the others poses the revolution and the subsequent founding of the Democratic Republic as proof of America's transformative capacity, that the ability to establish a democracy depends on a group of immigrants for it to happen. Although, as Professor Peterson pointed out, the idea that these people were immigrants is a really different idea than what we think about immigrants now. So these are some examples of how the show forwards the exceptionalist narrative lyrically, but I want to argue that the casting does as well. One of the frequently made observations of the show is the one that Professor Scott Saul made at the really fabulous panel on Hamilton that was last month, that the casting of Black and Latino actors as these white historical figures democratizes the theater and diversifies the ultra-white space of national narration. I think that that's unquestionably true. But I also wonder whether it buttresses this narrative about the US as a morally and politically superior nation on the argument that it has solved its racial divisions and tensions. And I'm going to read you an example of where that kind of argument has been used in other places in the public sphere. So the following is an excerpt from a speech by Condoleezza Rice when she was Secretary of State. This is in 2006, in the depths of the Iraq War, in a speech that she gave to the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. The School of Foreign Service, as I'm sure a lot of you know, is a feeder program that trains a lot of the people who go into the State Department. And during the Bush administration, particularly once the Iraq War was underway, there was a significant drop-off in people who were moving from this program into the State Department. The Bush administration became concerned about this fact, and especially about the fact that so few people of color were going into the State Department. So to persuade more people to join, Secretary Rice gave a speech to the school in which she noted the following. In a day and a time when difference is still a license to kill, America stands as a tremendous example of what can happen with people of diverse backgrounds, ethnic groups, and religions all call themselves American. Because it does not matter whether you are an Italian American or an African American or a Korean American, in order for America to fully play its role in the world, it must send out into the world a diplomatic force, a diplomatic corps that reflects its great diversity. She goes on to say, I sit in an office when I meet with foreign secretaries and foreign ministers from around the world that is a grand office that looks like it's actually out of the 19th century, although it was actually built in 1947, but that's very American too. And there's a portrait of Thomas Jefferson that looks directly at me when I am speaking to those foreign ministers, and I wonder sometimes, what would Mr. Jefferson have thought? What would he have thought about America's reach and influence in the world? What would he have thought about America's pursuit of the democratic enterprise on behalf of the peoples of the world? What would he have thought that an ancestor, that my ancestors, who were 3/5 of a man in his Constitution, would produce a Secretary of State who would carry out that mission? What Rice is saying here is that America's diversity is precisely what makes us a model democracy. The fact that as the descendant of a slave, she can become the Secretary of State and should serve as a model for other countries. But it assumes that somehow in the US, we are a place in which difference is no longer a license to kill, which I think is arguable at best. And it assumes that everyone in the US is already equal regardless of their race, an assumption about which there is significant debate. And that is what the casting in Hamilton says too, especially given the way that the musical, as T. Roberts noted in the panel last month, suppresses rather large historical problems like the fact that a whole slew of the figures the musical depicts were themselves slaveholders, including the Schuyler family that Hamilton married into and on whose behalf he apparently negotiated the sales of slaves. So, even though the casting asks us to rethink the racial identity of national space inside the US, It also does so in ways that are consistent with a narrative about the country that tidies up and glosses over the messier realities, not just of our histories of race, but of our contemporary lives as well. And if you're finding this line of thinking hard to agree with, you might ask yourself the question posed by Harvard historian Annette Gordon-Reed: imagine Hamilton with white actors, and ask yourself whether you're as happy with the picture of the founding that it paints. As a closing point, I want to offer two diverse pathways that the cultural absorption of Hamilton might take from this point. The first is to note the ways that the show's immigration narrative has become a protest slogan in the Trump era. This is a sign from the Women's March the day after the inauguration. And this is an image of a protest that took place in Texas this summer. There was a bill that had been proposed to suppress the creation of sanctuary cities in Texas, and on the day of the debate over the bill, a group of young Latino women held a protest on the steps of the state capitol, dressed in their quinceañera dresses. And as part of the protest, they performed a flash mob dance to that song, "Immigrants, We Get the Job Done." So that's one pathway. The second pathway is to point to some of the economics of the Broadway stage. Hamilton has been an unprecedented financial success. It had advanced ticket sales of over $32 million before it moved to Broadway, which I believe broke all the records for that financial marker. But where Broadway musicals really make their money is in what we call the back end, i.e., not when the show is in Manhattan, but when it goes on tour. And where most shows make the biggest cash for their producers and for their investors is when they tour East Asia. So Shanghai, Tokyo, Seoul, Taipei. You can have a show run on Broadway for a week and close, i.e. be a total flop, and it will run in those cities for months. So once the name of the Broadway imprimatur is attached to a show, it will become extremely successful when it tours internationally, especially in East Asia. So Hamilton has already started its national tour. It's about to open on the West End in London in December, and I promise that a tour of East Asia is just around the corner. And I want to leave you to think about what happens when this show, with all the energy and excitement that we know that it imparts, with all the historical elisions and evasions that it contains, becomes not just a story that we in America tell ourselves about ourselves, but export to the rest of the world. Thank you.
UC Berkeley is one of my favorite places. It's always great to be around so many brilliant people. So it just so happens that both Mark and Shannon said a lot of what I wanted to say, which is actually good. I mean, I'm going to say some of that, but a little differently. And I'm going to skip over some things. I may not take my whole 15 minutes. It might take less time. But let me just begin by saying that in terms of the play, before I say anything critical, I just want to say it's a really brilliant work of art. Okay, it's not history. Okay, and I think what I want to emphasize is that it's not really history. It's a great work of art. I mean, in terms of the lyrics, the music. My youngest son loves listening to the soundtrack. We listen to it all the time. He's like, I'm so tired of listening to John Coltrane. I want to listen to Hamilton. So we listen to it, and I don't want to make the claim that any work of theater ought to be history. License is something that we should always expect, and I'm not here to nitpick about accuracy, but I want to take seriously the question we're wrestling with, and that is who owns the founding. And what I kind of found somewhat frustrating about the play is that under the guise of diversifying, the founding of the nation, the essential narrative actually didn't change. In fact, I totally agree with both Shannon and Mark said this. It's a fairly conservative narrative. I mean, it's built on, Von Chernow's book. And it is still the story of how genius white men, with Hamilton, the most genius of all, forged this country into existence through courage under battle, a certain kind of masculinity, enlightened republicanism, wit, hard work, despite sharp disagreements, and disagreeable characters. So this is essentially, the version of Chernow's, what I feel like is a fawning, gushing biography of Hamilton, put on stage, but in a more digestible, dynamic form. In other words, it is the best of schoolhouse rock, but kind of PG-13. I mean, the best. And again, I'm not criticizing. I think lyrically, I don't know how he comes up with some of that stuff. He and other people wrote the music. And I don't blame Miranda at all for reading this text and saying this makes a great musical, because in some ways it's a Shakespearean story. You know, we think about the consistent rivalry with Aaron Burr, that ultimately ends in the duel and his death, the Horatio Alger story, the self-made man, the patriotism, the affairs, all that stuff. And by the way, most of the music, I think, is not about policy and ideas, but about the women. Not so much as autonomous figures, but sometimes as objects. You know, but we could talk about that. But what I'm concerned about is the work that the narrative does. In other words, this is not simply a matter of colorblind casting and hip-hop theater coming together, but by turning Hamilton into a modern-day immigrant, that is to say, a racialized subject, because he was born in Nevis, it obscures the fact that he was, as Mark said, a settler, and like all of the settlers, arrived in the New World. In the 18th century, you have to keep in mind that he was not born in the nation of Nevis. He was born in the British colony of Nevis, okay, which made him a British subject. His citizenship status was no different from all the other so-called founding fathers at the time of the adoption of the Constitution. In fact, he was a legal citizen at the time of the adoption of the Constitution. And like all the presidents except for Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren is the first US-born president. All the others were British, subject of the British Crown, and settlers. So having said that, one way to read the musical is as a contemporary story using historical figures. So it would be kind of like a modern day story of the racialized immigrant working hard in achieving something not just for himself, but for the country. Proving his worth, demonstrating humanity through imperfections, or as the radio spot that Lyra Montero talks about in her essay, there's a radio spot that was advertising a play that said, "This is the story of America then told by America now." But what it does is it creates a myth, a nostalgia for the days before the barriers were placed, imposed on the immigrant, before the barriers would limit the American dream to certain people. So the myth that the immigrants were among the founders is part of what the play actually tries to convey. But most university students know that that this is a white story, that the Naturalization Act of 1790 limited naturalizations to free white persons of good moral character, and all the rest were denied citizenship. So what's not clear from the soundtrack is that Hamilton and his Federalist Party actually opposed, aliens, opposed immigrants holding public office. It was the Federalists that pressed for a constitutional amendment barring naturalized foreigners from elected office. And the irony is that, of course, his rival, Aaron Burr, who's perceived as this really, not quite lowly, he's intelligent too, but Aaron Burr is seen as an opportunist. That's the best way I could think of it. But Aaron Burr was the one who got up before the New York Assembly at the time and spoke directly against these kinds of laws. He said, "America stood with open arms and presented an asylum to the oppressed of every nation. Shall we deprive these persons of an important right derived from so sacred a source as our Constitution?" Alexander Hamilton is also presented as somewhat of an abolitionist. And in fact, much of his stature is tied to his association with the New York Manumission Society. And Chernow portrays him as really a kind of militant abolitionist. In fact, there's a point where he joins the Manumission Society, and Chernow sort of suggests that Hamilton was far in advance of all the other members because he submitted a proposal saying that members of the Manumission Society should manumit their slaves. In other words, if you're a member of an organization calling for abolition or for manumission, you should actually do that. Because many members actually had slaves. But his plan was that anyone who owned slaves who were under 28 years old should free them by their 35th birthday. Which, to me, that's not quite, that's kind of like messed up, a form of manumission. It's like you got to wait more than 7 years, because in other words, if you're younger than 28. If you're between 28 and 38, you should be free within 7 years. Only if you're over 45 should you be freed immediately. And this is important, again, not criticizing Hamilton, but yeah, I'm criticizing Hamilton. When the Manumission Society decided to make manumission voluntary, that is, you don't have to free your slaves, but you can still be a member. Hamilton had nothing to say about it. He said, okay, well, cool. I'll accept that. So imagine the hypocrisy of calling yourself the New York Manumission Society made up of slaveholders. But that's another story. I'm going to skip some other stuff, but let me just say two things very quickly. In making these observations, I'm not suggesting that somehow, as some people have suggested, that we should then turn to another founding father as more representative. There's a lot of criticisms of Hamilton because of his role in constructing a certain kind of modern political economy around banking, central banking, around some of the other things, the fact that he was a Federalist and something of an elitist in terms of his portrait. Chernow, of course, is arguing against that. But the fact that this is the case, other people say, well, why not Jefferson? Why not others? Well, I would never make the case that any particular framer or founding father is more representative. In fact, part of the issue is that many of them represent property, accumulation, class rule, white supremacy, patriarchy. And so my question is, why not create a story that calls into question the standard narrative? In other words, I would much rather have the standard narrative kind of debunked or challenged, even if it was an all-white cast, But I understand the power of using people of color for one particular reason. In fact, I'm going to end with this. I'm going to skip over some stuff on Aaron Burr. And just the last point I want to make, so we can get to the discussion, is that, I understand, like, Scott Saul's argument, and I think it's a very useful one, that for theater goers, there's something very powerful about seeing these performances that are considered to be the traditional narrative played by people of color, because you see yourself in it. Okay, I could understand that. I could grasp that. But that's very dangerous to me, because I'm concerned about how black and brown actors, hip-hop culture in particular, Wendy talked about appropriation. I think this is something we also have to talk about. Hip-hop culture, vernacular culture, the spectacle of dancing and singing black and brown bodies on stage could make the creation of our settler colonial state, founded on dispossession, genocide, and enslavement, the drafting of a constitution that was essentially a pro-slavery document that gave Southern states more power, the promotion of what I would argue is definitely a brilliant thinker who nevertheless promoted a vision of what Cedric Robinson might call the anti-democracy, or at least upheld class hierarchy, that how could all these things become so sexy and become associated with the rebellions in the streets today? That critics are writing things like, well, this is sort of like the play for the Black Lives Matter generation and the Dreamers generation, when in fact, the ultimate story it tells pushes back against that, even though you can take from it a critique of current immigrant policies, but it does bring back this kind of nostalgia for the days when our founding fathers had it right. And if we can just go back to that, restore that, then things will be okay. And this is exactly what Black Lives Matter is fighting for. The restoration of the founding fathers' vision. Really? So that's my contribution for the conversation. I look forward to continuing with the rest of you. And like I said, I don't want to leave you thinking I'm bitter about the play. I'm going to continue listening to that soundtrack because it's hot.
Hi. You mentioned during the beginning when you were giving like what you believe the question of like what the founding is, you mentioned the cultural appropriation and how that's viewed throughout history through like costumes, movies, theater. But I think something that's failed to mention, and I guess is like kind of controversial, is the cultural appropriation of different white cultures. And if that is considered cultural appropriation, even if it is appropriated throughout theater and throughout music, and why that is never taken into account as well.
Can I ask a question about the question?
Yes.
So what do you mean by white cultures?
Okay. Yeah. So I just like, I guess the background kind of, if I can like say it for where the question's coming from, is like, it's Halloween coming up. And something I noticed was like all these posters and signs saying, don't appropriate different cultures, different histories. And there are traditional German costumes or traditional German clothes or wearings that come with traditional German festivals. And those things, when people wear them, it's not considered cultural appropriation. Even though it is appropriating a culture and a people's history, and why that's never taken into account. So I was just kind of wondering along those lines.
Well, no, it's a very good question. I think that sometimes we confuse cultural appropriation with a certain kind of masquerading. And I think it's two different things. In other words, everyone in this room is appropriating culture right now. I mean, even in terms of something as basic as the patterns of print, for example, could be from Indonesia, could be from all kinds of places like that, from India. But the Halloween issue, which I'm sensitive to, is like you don't walk around in blackface, for example, because blackface is not appropriating black culture. That's simply mimicking a form of minstrelsy and racial violence, and then making that, or ridiculing people, or I think that's a very different thing. If you decide to dress up like you imagine a Mexican to be, that's not so much about paying tribute to, that's about ridiculing and diminishing and degrading people. So I think that there is a line, and that's why those kinds of conversations have to be conversations as opposed to just simply, the law. But, part of the issue, though, why I asked the question about what is white culture, is that, and I would love to hear what Wendy has to say, because I really resonated with what she said about appropriation. There is something about the commodification of cultures that, when picked up and transformed into someone else's wealth, that's a very different thing. When the people who produced or invented things can never benefit financially from that. I love the fact that you talked about how much money is being made from Hamilton. And it's being made, certainly Manuel Miranda is making his money, the cast is making money, but all those young people who invented hip-hop culture in the first place, they're not getting paid. They can't copyright that stuff. But I know one thing, for anyone who I'm guessing, even though the Federalist Papers are probably in the public domain now, and I know he probably didn't make much money in his life, but people who write things and can have ownership and copyright of those things could actually benefit financially. So that's one thing to think about appropriation, but I'd love to.
Can I follow up and turn it as a question to you, Shannon? So when I saw the musical, it was here in San Francisco, and I know the casting changed from the Broadway as it moved on. But as I was watching the musical, and this I think might speak to your question, the two characters in the musical that seemed the whitest to me, that is, they had white actors in the roles, and the cultural style that they were performing seemed the whitest, were the king and the Anglican minister, right? In other words, minor villains, right?
Yeah.
The opponents. And I was curious.
Comic villains.
Yeah, very much comic villains too. They're figures of ridicule.
Yeah.
And I wondered what your thinking on the fact of that was.
I mean, I think that gets us back to this sort of narrative that the musical has about diversity triumphing over bad British monarchy and like atavistic systems of democracy, atavistic systems of governance that the U.S. triumphed over as a result of its democracy, right? So I think that's where the casting, I think, moves that narrative further along in that sort of construction of the founding further along. So I think that there's a whole really complicated question about casting in the musical and the history of cross-racial casting on the American stage, and the history and the way that this musical tried to restructure that as what they called race-conscious casting.
Right, yeah.
So that there had been a previous history in the US. I almost started this talk actually by talking about the history of hip-hop musicals, which actually starts with a hip-hop adaptation of Love, Labour's Lost by Shakespeare. And there was a debate that circulated at the time that show emerged, which was about what it means to make Shakespeare into hip-hop. And people are saying, you can't do this to Shakespeare, this is terrible, blah, 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 blah. Which brings up the question of like, who owns Shakespeare, right? But that was part of a history of sort of taking classical canonical drama and updating it and making it more marketable and more interesting by taking it out of a kind of like European cultural milieu and making it into an American one by having cross-racial casting it, by having non-traditional casting in it, which brought up a whole question about what it meant to retain the narratives of European culture and only diversify them insofar as it made them a more interesting marketing strategy. Right. And there are ways in which Hamilton does that too, actually. So I think that to the extent that Hamilton continues an appropriationist model, that's the one that it continues. So that's interesting.
We have a question over here.
First, want to thank the panelists and especially thank Wendy for those framing comments up front, which I thought were just tremendous. Yeah. So my question is, so I agree with the argument that the depiction of Hamilton plays into this sort of heroizing, narrative of American history. I want to ask you to comment on a flip side of it, which is the depiction of Jefferson and Madison in the play. Because teaching PS1, Intro to American Politics, the textbook reading is Madison, the father of the Constitution, great democratic leader. Jefferson, the initial high school civics depiction is both of them as democratic leaders, and actually Hamilton as the anti-democratic leader. But just focusing on them, what the play does, this kind of inversion where they're the villains of the play. And so just to comment, I mean, just as an anecdote, my daughter, who loves the play, to this day, anytime anybody mentions Thomas Jefferson's name, it's sort of hiss, and the same thing about Madison. And I think, when you read Robin Einhorn's book on American history of taxation, I'm like, well, that's not, the heroizing of Hamilton, not so great, but the villainizing of Madison and Jefferson, well, there's something there. So just want folks to comment on that, maybe.
I'm sorry.
Okay, well, just very quickly, because I want to talk. I think there's three things. One, I think that the work of vilifying Jefferson precedes the play. No, in other words, no, I mean that because you mentioned Annette Gordon-Reed. I think her book, although she doesn't try to vilify Jeff, that's not what she does. No. But there's a reading of it that suggests that maybe in all this work of writing about sort of what it meant to be in Monticello with all your slaves, and also thinking about democracy and republicanism, and so there's a way in which I come out of a long tradition of critique of Jefferson, but not a long tradition of raising Hamilton up, right? So in some ways I could see that. In other ways, in terms of the way the play worked out these, this is a perfect vehicle even to make Madison a villain. I mean, we all know that Hamilton took almost everything he knew from Madison. He was a very, my understanding of it, in terms of how much Madison contributed to the Federalists, and that they were very close, and they eventually broke. But the fact that they were close and that intellectually close is something that's very, very important. And so if you are raised in a culture in which we only understand politics in terms of personalities, heroes and villains, Trump and Clinton. I mean, these are the kind of narrative that people are coming up with. You can't think of it as anything else but that. Which is why at the end of my talk I was saying, well, I'm not willing to go the other way, and that is to say that there should be a rivalry, because all of them in some ways are very problematic and also very important in terms of reading and understanding. So I guess the third, that's the second thing, but the final thing just has to do with the way that Hamilton was a pretty obscure figure among the populace. That Ron Chernow's book, I think, is a very important contribution, because the popularity of that book and the fact that he played a role as an advisor for the musical meant that it's really his story. And so when I've read that book, and he's much more critical of Jefferson, in the book. He's raising Hamilton up. And the way he presents it is that Jefferson, less so than Aaron Burr, but Jefferson is definitely a man of principle, but he's also a politician. Whereas Hamilton seems to come across as certainly having certain strategies to support various people, but ultimately Hamilton's principles are what raises him to like a higher level. That's my reading of the book, and I think that plays itself out in the play.
Well, the one thing I would add to that is that by highlighting the Jefferson-Hamilton conflict, whichever side you decide are the villains or the heroes, you're creating a suggestion that between them they cover the entire spectrum of the possible, right? Whereas what they fundamentally agreed on was a desire to make the United States into a continental settler colonial empire that could project power widely against European competitors as well. And there were lots of other places on the spectrum besides that place, right? And so, sure, Hamilton's the good one and Jefferson's the bad one. It doesn't make that much difference in a certain sense if you think that what they together represent is all there is to talk about, or the only necessary direction for events to take in the 1780s, 90s, wherever.
The only thing that I have to say about that is actually what has happened when I've taught the musical in my classes, that one of the things the students come back and say is they say, I wish that this was how we taught history, which usually I listen to, and I say, why? So what is it about this that you feel like is missing? And they say, well, we get all the sense of like the fights that people had and the way that those fights were sometimes interpersonal, and that people had affairs, and that the founding of the country was really messy, and that these people weren't these paragons of virtue. And mostly I sit there thinking, like, that is exactly what I teach in my classes, so what am I doing wrong that isn't getting this? But it is really interesting that the students, one of the ways that people are responding to the musical is that they're telling us something about the narratives that we have around the founding that are just tidy, and that they're tired of them being tidy. So even if on the one hand the musical creates a kind of villains versus heroes narrative, which I think you're right about, I think it does, there are other elements of what they're seeing inside of that that are about the profound untidiness of the founding, and that the founding was not this kind of Olympian moment of the gods descending upon us and giving birth to democracy and everything else. So that part of the musical I think is actually pretty interesting and useful.
Right here. Just 1 second, we're going to bring you a mic because we're streaming.
I hope this doesn't upset people, but does anybody want to make a comment about or compare 1776 to Hamilton? The music?
Well, sure. I'm not sure why it would be an upsetting question. It's...
Do you want to ask it in an upsetting way?
Yeah.
just so they know what you're trying to get at.
I've never throw in another musical.
Oh, yeah.
Because
you have permission.
What somebody said was the beauty of Hamilton is that you take this obscure person, who was certainly obscure to me, I know he's on the $10 bill, but I know that, as a matter of fact, when I was in high school, junior high school, Hamilton was 2 paragraphs in the history book. So I didn't get much, except that he was killed by Aaron Burr in a duel. When I saw 1776, it was the first time I felt a connection to the Declaration of Independence and the 39 people who signed it. And this play, Hamilton, kind of did that for me too. It gave me, if not faces, personalities to the history that I held on to the details better, a perspective, an environment even. And 1776 did that for me as well.
I'll
And
say
my
a little bit
favorite
about that.
song is the one sung by Mr.
From South Carolina?
Yes.
Yeah, I kind of thought you might. Yeah, I agree. So I actually, in my American Revolution classes in the past, have done showing clips of various movies or theatrical performances around, and I wrote a little article about this that's available on the web if I can tell people where to find it if they're interested. And I actually think 1776 is quite interesting. I mean, it's certainly not doing what Hamilton is in terms of color-conscious casting or anything like that. But what it does is it's set over the course of basically a month, right? And because it is, it actually can get quite deep into the issues around, you know, why declare independence, who's for it, who's against it, what the arguments are, etc. And the thing that I actually found oddly less satisfying about Hamilton was the fact that it's trying to cover his entire life. And everything goes by so fast that you don't get much of any sense of why anything happens, right? Oh, suddenly Jefferson and Hamilton are mad at each other, and here they go, and then they're done, and now it's on to whatever the next thing is. So, I mean, I'm not qualified to compare the music or anything about that, but I will say that of the various theatrical performances that have to do with the Revolution, I actually like 1776 the best because you actually can, as you say, who are these people and why do they think what they think and what are they arguing about?
I want to, oh, I'm sorry. No, go ahead. Okay. I want to just pose a question that takes us back to your original question about whiteness that speaks to comments each of you made. So you've given us a picture of a wildly successful, hot, hip-hop musical that is successful in part because it's a contemporary appropriation for purposes of thinking about immigration and multiculturalism, and I'm using that word on purpose, in a way that makes everything go down really wonderfully. And so you're telling us that the very thing that works about this and that has made it such a sensation and has brought Cheney and Obama together and almost everyone else except for the current vice president, but it has brought us, and everybody loves it and everybody finds something to love, even those who have always said, I can't follow hip hop, it's all yelling, it's all screaming. I mean, those in a certain generation and so forth. Everybody loves it. What's wrong with it is also, as you've all described it, that very problem, that it's a set of appropriations and reworkings of what is basically a founding in settler colonialism, patriarchy, slavery, property, etc. And all of that suddenly looks sexy, hot, multicultural, and pro-immigrant. So the question I want to pose is not particularly answerable, but I wonder if you'd be willing to ruminate on it. Could you imagine how Lin-Manuel Miranda could have done this, pushing toward a more critical or radical interpretation, still maybe doing the race-conscious thing, still maybe engaging in a kind of appropriation of whiteness that figured it differently, but bringing to the surface the very things you think he's burying, and keeping Cheney and others on board? Or is it the case that what you're describing is a success that precisely succeeded because it's so conservative, so mainstream, and involves this appropriation that we all can kind of enjoy, even if the critical intellectuals among us are tisk-tisking? So would you just ruminate there somewhere about whether, and I'm not asking you to write the next, the successful musical, but I am asking whether you think the edges could have been pushed further, and still held on to that spectacular bringing together of a big chunk of the nation around this musical that actually, as each of you is arguing, doesn't do much to get us out of our contemporary fix or to think critically about it.
Right. You lost me with Cheney. That was the problem.
So who's going first?
I'm going to say something that's a little bit flip, but that I think is actually true, which is that I'm thinking of that film Hamlet 2, where there's a high school musical teacher who goes back and rewrites Hamlet's sequel, where Hamlet is in a time machine and he is raised from the dead and he goes back. Like, I almost feel like this is all very silly, but on some level, I don't think you can address the racial complexities that Morgan, you were describing in terms of the settler colonialism, the patriarchalism of the founding of the country, in any meaningful way, and also have the racial conscious casting. I think that if you bring those two things together, and unless you are intentionally trying to create cognitive dissonance between the race of the actors and the race of the characters, which this show does not do, right? It never really actually fully addresses that, right? Like, it's a convention that you ease into 10 seconds after the actors walk onto the stage and you never think about it again. So unless there's something inside of the narrative that creates dissonance against that gap between the actor and the character, then you could do it. But that would be the only way to do it. And I think that, like, the Cheneys of the world are not going to be happy with that, because it's going to ask them to think about the things about the founding of the country that they don't like to admit to, right? When I'll stop there.
Yeah.
Well, I have one relatively simple way that you could alter the music. I mean, it would be a big alteration, but it would require the audience to accept that there were tragic dimensions to the American Revolution, that there were things lost as well as things gained by it. And this is a little plug for my book, because I'm actually doing this in the book that's coming out next year with Princeton University Press. And the character that you would have to add is Phyllis Wheatley, who was a brilliant American poet who happened to be African in birth and enslaved. So she was part of that wave that I was talking about, who comes to North America. And she is owned by a Boston family, but she is quite unusual in that her family recognizes a remarkable talent in her, helps her learn to read, gets education, and through connection to transatlantic circles in the British Empire that are actually interested not just in manumission, but actually ameliorating and bringing slavery to an end. She meets some of these people and they support her and promote her. And the story that I tell in this particular chapter in the book is how, in fact, the coming of the revolution to Boston is a tragedy in her life. It destroys this world of transatlantic ties that are starting to push in this direction, and essentially breaks the United States away from an anti-slavery tradition that the revolution destroys, right? And of course, Jefferson comments on Wheatley's work. He comments critically, sarcastically, saying it's sort of the best that you could expect an African to do, but it's not really poetry. I mean, he's really quite awful about this. It would add, to go to Eric's question, to the villainy of Jefferson in this, but to do that, you'd have to be able to have an audience say, yeah, there were ways in which the revolution's outcome destroyed powerful things that could have been better.
Right.
And that's a hard sell.
It's interesting you talk about those. It's funny you mentioned that, because you raised an interesting question, because one of the plays I was thinking about, which is not about the revolution or the founding fathers, but it's about that period, was a play by Naomi Wallace called The Liquid Plain. And the Liquid Plain, of course, comes from one of Phyllis Wheatley's poems. And you're absolutely right about that. In fact, I completely agree about the importance of her as a major character. The Liquid Plain, and I should just say by way of disclosure, my wife was one of the stars in that play. The play,
We're all plugs all the time. Yeah.
The play
Didn't
went
really.
nowhere.
Okay, yeah.
The play went nowhere because the New York Times critics couldn't understand it. They couldn't understand that part of what was happening on stage wasn't simply the story of slavery and the struggles for emancipation, but it was also about the kinds of forms of bondage that men in the whole maritime world, irrespective of color, had to face. So it's a really interesting, in the moment of between the American Revolution and the Haitian Revolution, and then after Haiti, then on to like the 1830s. So it's an interesting sort of example of how those kinds of tensions, and it's not a musical, could exist on stage in very powerful ways and move audiences, but not get the kind of support. Now, to go back to the original question, I do think that there is a way that cast and that dynamism, that art form can actually tell a very, very different story. And I agree it could be has tragic dimensions. But to me, what's missing is the question of power. That's the basic thing that's missing. Because one of the things, because I know you use multiculturalism very deliberately. Multiculturalism, the language of diversity, is about evacuating any sense of power and basically putting people in the same space to show that we are both equal and that we learn to share that space. So in Hamilton, the question of power really revolves around the crown, and the Patriots, then moves to the question of individual personalities vying for power. There's no sense that there's indigenous people who are being just wiped out in the creation of this new nation. All the things you talked about in terms of settler colonialism, that there are other people who are struggling, in some ways victims of that process, that there are certain people who are not benefiting from it, and even within that, there are all these rebellions that are taking place. When the song about the farmers, well, there's the farmers and then there's the farmers who are, in fact, oftentimes in rebellion in the 1790s. The Anti-Sedition Acts, 1798, Alien Anti-Sedition Acts are about trying to suppress forms of opposition, and to raise the question about what kind of country America could be had other forces been in play and not been defeated. To me, that's part of the question that we have to ask about. What is the founding? What are the foundings? In a play, you can have a play like that. You can have all that great talent, but we wouldn't be talking about it. Because it would have been on stage for about 3 weeks, and they would have closed it. And I don't think
money in China, though, right?
Yeah, well, maybe. But that's the tragedy, is that it's precisely because the messiness of the question of diversity, that is, the messiness of, as you said, that it's not simply difference by race or ethnicity or nation that matters. It's the relations of power that structure difference. That's the question about the relations of power. If you take that off the table, then everyone could feel good. Because you're like, oh yeah, I can see myself up there, and then you go outside and you get stopped by the police, And it's like, the question of power is gone.
What I'm going to do at this point is collect the remaining questions. Take, Alex, is it okay to go 5 minutes over?
Sure, and we have a question here, a question there.
Yeah.
The other thing we can do is we're having a reception outside, and they can just ask their questions of the people out there.
I think because people would love to hear the questions,
yes.
If you don't mind, if everyone will just say their question, and then we'll just wrap up, and then we'll go outside. I think there's one right down here.
And then
Okay,
so it's
fine.
3.
So my question is kind of tied to the class that I'm taking. So
A little bit louder, please.
I'm a student enrolled in a musicals and American history class in which we look at American history, American musicals, and we kind of retro analyze them from the perspective of today, because that's our perspective now. And we talked about Hamilton in class. And my question is more about going from now, like what does the future look like? We can recognize the issues of American musicals in the past because we have started to address those issues already. But for Hamilton, which came out 2 years ago, the issues still pertain to now. So having Black and brown actors and actresses playing slave owners, right? What does that look like for Black and brown youth who are watching this show, right? How do we address some of the effects of Hamilton in our society now that it's out and in mass production? And then also, what does it look like for future musicals who are hoping to make commentary on social political factors of today, and how can they use Hamilton as a basis to perhaps make more progressive musicals? Or
Great.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. Right here.
I'll just put that on my
Okay.
Okay. She's coming.
It's coming at you.
Hello, thank you guys for making this possible. This was a very thought-provoking process, and thank you, Professor Steen, for your talk. You discussed the impact of Hamilton on the younger generation, and I'm really interested in that area. And my question is, despite all the nuanced narrative, and definitely there's problems with the play, do you feel that there's a positive impact? Do you feel that the play has a positive impact on the youth, especially those of color? And if so, do you feel that more strides should be taken to increase the exposure of this play to more people who would not necessarily afford it? Especially, you mentioned that Broadway and the theater industry in general has mass profits and from this play, and it's going on tour and all of that. Do you feel like there are ways that they would be able to fund or sponsor programs that could spread, that could give the youth more opportunity to watch this play? Because
Great.
I
Thank
feel
you.
that.
Okay.
Oh,
That's terrific. We're running out of time, so yeah.
Sure.
Okay, last question.
Well,
As
first,
compressed as you can.
I was thinking so much about two long time ago profs here, Jack Shar and Sheldon Wolin, today with
Sheldon
the
Wolin.
questions that were brought up. I think, in some respect, everybody's sitting with this, and a number of you phrased it in different ways. Mark saying, this moment as a founding moment, and the question of white nationalism that we're living with, the stakes of that. I didn't think I was going to get called on.
Right,
Okay.
the stakes.
Thank
White
you.
nationalism.
Great. Why don't we just get a sentence or two from each of you, and we'll wrap up. You get to.
I don't know.
You know what? You can't answer this comprehensively, so say what you wish at this point.
I'm going to address the second to last question that we got. I think for me, the thing that is most helpful, most hopeful, and most interesting is that stuff about the protest stuff that I showed, the images of, like that image of the women in their quinceañera dresses on the steps of the state capitol in Texas, using that song to fight back against anti-immigration legislation, I think is fabulous. And so if there is this huge question, what does it mean to have all of that passion resting on a narrative that might be really deeply inaccurate, is a really important one. And part of me cares more about the fact that they're going to push back against the legislation that's coming forward. Like, in some ways, I feel like if what this musical unleashes is that kind of political passion and power, then that's great. And I don't know that people need to see the musical in order to hear that. Like, it feels like the music is doing that on its own. So that's where I'll pass that.
Right. In one sentence, I not only agree, but I think that the reason that we're here is because of the play. So I think it's been an amazing lightning rod to have these conversations, including the conversations about who owns the founding in terms of white nationalism. That we can now have that conversation in a way tied to whatever critique we may have. Without it, we'd have fewer things to kind of tie it to. So I'm just thankful that we're all here together to talk about it.
Right. I'll just quickly add that I agree that the emotion, the power that you talk about in terms of energizing people and helping them to get engaged is really important. But I also think we're in the midst of a long, slow constitutional crisis in this country, and that thinking hard and carefully and knowing the real story has to be an important element for however we go forward from this.
That's true. That's true.
So let me take a moment first again to thank Alex for keeping on the same page, keeping on. Eric Schickler for thinking this was the right question to consider. And Robin and Shannon and Mark for taking time out of extraordinary schedules, pressures, political anxieties, sleepless nights, traveling, working, and giving us just a brilliant springboard for rethinking and thinking about Hamilton. Thank you.
Thank you.